We often spend our lives walking on eggshells, measuring our words to fit into the spaces others have carved for us. We say sorry for taking up room, for having an opinion, or simply for existing in a way that doesn't align with expectations. But there is a quiet, transformative power in finally standing tall and letting your true self breathe without apology. It starts with a single moment of clarity, a realization that your joy does not require a permit from the world around you. When one person decides to live authentically, it creates a ripple that can change the heart of an entire community. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the old oak diner, casting long golden rectangles across the checkered floor. Elena sat at her usual corner booth, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped ceramic mug as she watched the town stir to life. For years, she had been the woman who apologized for everything, the way she laughed too loudly, her unconventional art, even the way she took her coffee. She felt the familiar weight of a dozen sorries resting on her tongue, ready to be deployed at the slightest hint of friction. But today, the air felt different, charged with a silent resolution that had been brewing in her heart for weeks. Across the table, Marcus and Sarah were already deep in hushed conversation, their faces reflecting the same weary restlessness Elena felt. They had grown up in this town where tradition was a heavy blanket, keeping everyone warm, but also smothering the fire of individuality. Marcus, a gifted baker who dreamed of fusion recipes, usually hid his best work behind standard glazed donuts to avoid being too much. Sarah, a brilliant mechanical mind, often downplayed her skills to fit the quiet, reserved role the neighborhood expected of her. They looked at each other, acknowledging the invisible scripts they had been following for far too long. "I didn't make the plain rolls today," Marcus said as he set a box on the table, his hands just barely trembling. Inside were vibrant, spiced pastries topped with zesty glazes and crushed nuts, smelling of cardamom and daring. He paused, waiting for that familiar wave of guilt, the urge to apologize for straying from the menu everyone knew by heart. But instead, he took a slow breath and met Elena's eyes, finding a reflection of his own small, growing spark of defiance. The scent of the spices drifted through the booth, a fragrant little rebellion against the bland expectations of their small-town life. Sarah reached out and took a pastry, her smile widening as she tasted the bold, unfamiliar flavors that Marcus had suppressed for years. She realized then that she had spent her entire morning rehearsing an apology to her boss for suggesting a more efficient way to run the local garage. The words felt like ash in her mouth now, and she took a deliberate sip of her coffee, letting the heat ground her in the present moment. She watched the townspeople walking past the window, many of them hunched under the weight of their own unspoken regrets. It was time to stop being a background character in her own story, and she knew her friends felt the same. A neighbor, Mrs. Gable, stopped by their booth and peered at the colorful pastries with a look of confused disapproval that would have normally sent Marcus into a flurry of excuses. Elena felt the tension rise in the air, that split second where they usually folded, and offered a polite, shrinking explanation for their choices. Marcus opened his mouth, and for a heartbeat, the old "I'm sorry" hovered there, ready to smooth things over. But he caught Elena's supportive nod and simply smiled, offering Mrs. Gable a warm greeting without a single word of contrition. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was a boundary being drawn in the sand. As the trio eventually stepped out of the diner, the cool morning air hit their faces, feeling sharper and clearer than it had in years. They walked down Main Street, noticing the way the shadows of the Victorian buildings stretched across the pavement like reaching fingers. Every person they passed seemed to be performing a carefully choreographed dance of politeness and repression. Elena noticed a young girl being shushed by her mother for skipping, and she felt a pang of recognition that turned into a quiet, burning strength. They weren't just changing their own habits, they were testing the structural integrity of a culture built on shrinking oneself. They gathered at the local park, sitting on a bench beneath a sprawling willow tree whose branches swayed like green silk in the breeze. Marcus talked about the fear of the town's reaction, the way people whispered when someone stepped out of the narrow lines of the ordinary. Sarah admitted that the hardest part wasn't the judgment of others, but the way she judged herself for wanting more than what was offered. They spoke of the exhaustion that comes from constant self-editing, a fatigue that had settled into their bones over decades. Yet, as they talked, the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the vibrant colors of the world around them. Elena took out a sketchbook, a hobby she usually hid away because she feared people would think her drawings were too abstract or strange. She began to draw with bold, sweeping strokes, her charcoal scratching against the paper in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. When a passerby slowed down to look, Elena didn't tilt the book away or offer a self-deprecating comment about her lack of formal training. She simply continued to create, her eyes focused on the interplay of light and shadow on the grass. The act of creation, without a preemptive apology, felt like a physical weight lifting off her shoulders. In the distance, the town clock chimed the hour, a resonant sound that echoed through the valley and seemed to punctuate their silent pact. They weren't planning a grand protest or a loud announcement. They were simply choosing to be whole people in a place that preferred fragments. Each of them knew the coming days would bring confused glances and perhaps even cold shoulders from those who feared change. But as they sat together, the warmth of the sun on their skin felt like a blessing, a quiet confirmation that they were finally on the right path. The first step had been taken, and there was no turning back to the shadows of sorry. Marcus looked at his friends, his expression softening as he realized that for the first time, he wasn't looking for an exit strategy from the conversation. Usually, he would have checked his watch and apologized for taking up their time, scurrying back to the safety of the bakery's back room. Now, he leaned back against the bench, watching a hawk circle high above in the endless blue sky. The bird didn't apologize for its sharp wings or its piercing cry. It simply occupied the sky, because that was where it belonged. He felt a sense of belonging, too, rooted not in the town's approval, but in his own skin. Sarah stood up, her movements fluid and confident as she stretched her arms toward the canopy of the willow tree. She thought about the garage and the tools that felt like extensions of her own hands, and she smiled at the thought of the work ahead. She would go in tomorrow and speak her mind, not with aggression, but with the calm authority of someone who knew her worth. The fear was still there, a small hum in the back of her mind, but it no longer had the power to dictate her posture. She looked at Elena and Marcus, seeing the same quiet fire reflecting in their eyes as the afternoon light deepened. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the clouds in shades of peach and violet, the three friends began their walk back toward the center of town. They passed the library the post office, and the small grocery store, seeing these familiar places through a lens of newfound clarity. They were no longer just residents following a script. They were individuals choosing to write a new chapter for themselves, and perhaps for the town. The air felt lighter. Or maybe it was just that they were no longer carrying the heavy burden of unnecessary guilt. They parted ways at the town square, each heading home to face a world that hadn't changed yet. But they knew they had. The next morning, the bell above the bakery door chimed with a frequency that Marcus hadn't heard in years, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed through the quiet street. He stood behind the counter, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, as the tray of mango habanero scones sat proudly in the center of the display. Usually, he would have tucked them in the corner, ready to apologize to the first customer for the, quote, experimental nature of his work. Instead, he wiped his hands on his apron and stood tall, meeting the confused gaze of the town's mayor, who was staring at the vibrant orange glaze. The air in the bakery smelled of citrus and courage, a sharp departure from the scent of plain yeast and tradition that usually defined the space. Mayor Henderson cleared his throat, pointing a stout finger at the tray and asking if the oven had malfunctioned or if Marcus had simply run out of regular sugar. Marcus felt the old, practiced "I'm so sorry, sir" rising in his throat, a reflex born from decades of trying to remain invisible and compliant. He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel the weight of his own agency. And then he simply smiled. "It's a new recipe I've been perfecting, Mayor. I think the spice brings out the sweetness in a way we haven't tried here before," he said clearly. The mayor blinked, surprised by the lack of an excuse, and eventually grunted, buying 2 scones with a look of begrudging curiosity. At the town garage, Sarah stood before a disassembled tractor engine, the grease under her fingernails feeling like a badge of honor rather than something to be hidden. Her boss, Jim, was hovering nearby, already starting to explain how they had always done things the old way when it came to hydraulic repairs. Sarah listened patiently, but she didn't offer the usual nod of submissive agreement or the apology for having a different perspective on the torque settings. She picked up a heavy wrench, its cold steel reassuring in her palm, and began to explain the physics of her proposed adjustment. Her voice was steady, devoid of the upward inflection that usually turned her statements into timid questions. Jim paused, his weathered face a mask of skepticism, waiting for her to backtrack or soften her stance to make him feel more comfortable. When Sarah didn't waver, he looked at the engine and then back at her, seeing a focus in her eyes that he hadn't noticed in the 5 years she'd worked there. He didn't offer praise that wasn't the way of this town, but he stepped back and gestured for her to continue, a silent concession of space. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the machinery and everything to do with the boundary she had successfully maintained. She worked with a newfound fluidity, her mind clear of the mental static that usually came from second-guessing her own expertise. Alana spent her afternoon in the town square, setting up an easel near the fountain where the local garden club was busy pruning the rose bushes. She began to paint with vivid, clashing colors that captured the energy of the moving water rather than the literal shapes of the stone. The women of the club watched her from under their sun hats, their whispers fluttering like the wings of nervous sparrows in the afternoon heat. One of them, a woman named Clara, who had known Alana since childhood, approached and asked why the water in the painting was purple. Alana didn't flinch or offer a nervous laugh about her silly imagination, but instead invited Clara to look at the way the light refracted in the spray. I see it this way today, Clara, Elena said softly, her brush continuing to dance across the canvas without a moment of hesitation. Clara looked at the painting, then at the fountain, and for a brief second, her rigid posture softened as she tried to see what Elena saw. She didn't offer a compliment, but she didn't offer a critique either. She simply nodded and returned to her roses, leaving Elena in peace. The sun beat down on the square, highlighting the contrast between the manicured gardens and the wild, expressive strokes on the canvas. Elena felt a sense of liberation so profound it brought a lump to her throat, a realization that she didn't need permission to see the world differently. By late afternoon, word had begun to spread through the neighborhood about the strange atmosphere clinging to the three friends like a new scent. At the local post office, people exchanged glances that were heavy with unspoken questions, wondering why the trio seemed so unbothered by the subtle social pressures. There was a tension in the air, a resistance from those who found comfort in the predictable sorries that usually greased the wheels of their daily interactions. Yet, beneath the tension, there was also a flicker of something else, a quiet, buried envy from those who were tired of their own constant apologizing. The town felt like a spring, coiled too tight, waiting for something to give way under the pressure of this new authenticity. Marcus closed the bakery early, his trays empty for the first time in months, though he knew some people had bought the scones just to have something to complain about. He walked toward the park, noticing how the shadows of the trees seemed to point toward the center of town like accusing fingers. He saw a group of teenagers laughing loudly on a street corner, and when an older man glared at them, one of the girls started to apologize before catching herself. She looked at Marcus, who gave her a small, knowing nod, and she stood a little straighter, her laughter softening, but not disappearing entirely. It was a small moment, almost invisible, but to Marcus, it felt like a victory for everyone who had ever felt too loud. As the sun slipped low and the blue hour settled in, Sarah met him at the park gates, her coveralls marked with oil, yet her face brighter than he had ever seen in the soft, fading light. She told him about the tractor and about how Jim had finally listened when she stopped treating her own knowledge like it was something to hide. They sat together on the same bench as the day before, the woods still holding the last warmth of the departing sun, while the crickets began their evening chorus. They were tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from building something real, not from keeping up a facade. Around them, the world eased gently into the blue hour, that quiet, magical moment when the line between what is and what could be starts to blur. Elena joined them a few minutes later, her hands still stained with purple paint, and her eyes reflecting the first few stars appearing in the darkening sky. She told them about Clara and the fountain, laughing gently at the memory of the garden club's collective confusion at her bold colors. They realized that the sorries they had discarded weren't just words. They were the bricks of a wall they had been building around themselves for a lifetime. With every withheld apology, they were dismantling that wall, brick by brick, and letting the light of their true selves shine through. The night air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the lingering spice of Marcus's baking, a scent that felt like home should. As they sat in the gathering dark, a few other locals drifted toward the park, including a young teacher named David, who always looked like he was carrying the weight of the world. He sat on a nearby bench, watching them with a mix of awe and hesitation, as if he wanted to ask them for the secret to their quiet confidence. The park was filled with the soft sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a car, and the rhythmic breathing of friends who finally felt at peace. They didn't need to fill the silence with nervous chatter or explanations for why they were there so late. They simply existed in the space, three people who had decided that their presence was enough, exactly as it was. The moon rose over the horizon, a silver sliver that illuminated the path leading back to the heart of the town they both loved and struggled with. They knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, that the unspoken rules wouldn't vanish overnight, just because they had stopped following them. But the shift had begun, a quiet tectonic movement in the emotional landscape of their community that couldn't be easily reversed. As they stood to leave, they didn't apologize for the long silence or the late hour. They simply squeezed each other's hands in a small, steady gesture of solidarity. Then they walked back into the town, not as rebels, but as pioneers of a simpler, more honest way of being. The following Monday, a soft rain began to fall, pattering against the shop windows and darkening the pavement to a deep, reflective slate. In the quiet hush of morning, Marcus stood at his counter, watching the droplets race down the glass, while a small line of customers waited for his now famous spiced rolls. At the very front of that line stood Mrs. Gable, who had been so critical just days before, her umbrella dripping onto the floor as she looked at him. Instead of rushing to mop it up with a frantic apology for the wet tiles, Marcus simply nodded and handed her a warm pastry with a steady hand. She hesitated, her mouth forming the shape of a complaint. But when she saw his calm, unshakable kindness, she simply took the bag and whispered a quiet, "Thank you." Over at the garage, Sarah was teaching a young apprentice how to calibrate a complex fuel injector, her movements precise and full of a quiet authority. When the boy dropped a heavy wrench, his face instantly went pale as he began a stuttering, desperate string of "I'm sorries" that echoed off the metal walls. Sarah stopped what she was doing, knelt down to pick up the tool, and looked him directly in the eyes with a gentle, reassuring smile. She told him that mistakes were just lessons dressed in frustration, and that he didn't need to apologize for the process of learning. The boy's shoulders dropped 3 inches as the tension left his frame, and for the first time, he actually focused on the engine instead of his fear of failing. Alana spent her afternoon in the town library, hanging her latest series of paintings on the community board with the help of David, the young teacher. The artwork was vibrant and unapologetic, a riot of colors that seemed to pulse against the sterile, beige walls of the reading room. As they worked, several elderly residents gathered to watch, their faces a mix of confusion and a slow, dawning appreciation for the boldness on display. David admitted that he had stopped apologizing to the school board for his creative lesson plans, and he felt a weight lift that he hadn't realized he was carrying. They stood back to look at the wall, seeing not just art, but a visual map of a community beginning to find its own voice. That evening, the 3 friends met at the diner, but this time they weren't tucked away in a corner booth trying to remain inconspicuous. They sat in the center of the room, their laughter mingling with the clinking of silverware and the low hum of the overhead fans. Other patrons began to drift over, not to complain or whisper, but to share their own small stories of moments where they had finally stood their ground. One man spoke of finally telling his brother he couldn't lend him money anymore, while a waitress admitted she had stopped apologizing for her tired eyes. The air in the diner felt electric, charged with the collective relief of people who were finally allowing themselves to be human. As the weeks turned into months, the Old Oak Diner and the bakery became hubs for a new kind of social currency, one based on honesty rather than polite repression. The town didn't transform into a perfect utopia overnight, but the sharp edges of judgment had begun to wear down into something smoother and more empathetic. People still disagreed, and mistakes were still made, but the reflexive sorry had been replaced by a more meaningful, how can we fix this? The traditional rules hadn't disappeared, but they had been rewritten to include room for the quirks and dreams that made each person unique. Marcus, Sarah, and Elena watched the change with a sense of quiet wonder, knowing they had only provided the spark. One Saturday afternoon, the town held its annual spring festival, and for the first time in memory, the booths weren't just filled with the usual crafts and predictable jams. There were tables for, quote, misfit pottery, a stage for amateur poetry, and a corner where people could simply sit and talk about their hopes without feeling too much. Marcus's stall was a kaleidoscope of flavors, and he moved with a grace that came from no longer trying to shrink his presence to fit a mold. Sarah spent the day showing children how to build small solar-powered cars, her hands covered in grease, and her heart full of a purpose she had finally claimed. They were no longer the, quote, rebellious few. They were the heartbeat of a town that had finally learned to breathe. Elena stood on a small hill overlooking the festivities, her sketchbook open to a page that was no longer hidden behind a protective arm. She drew the scene below the laughter, the vibrant colors of the tents, and the way the people moved with a lightness that hadn't been there a year ago. She realized that by stopping their apologies, they hadn't become colder or more selfish. They had actually become more connected to those around them. When you stop apologizing for who you are, you give everyone else the silent permission to do the same, creating a space where true kindness can flourish. She closed her book with a satisfied snap, the setting sun casting a long, peaceful shadow across the grass. As the festival lights began to twinkle in the twilight, Marcus and Sarah joined her on the hill, the three of them looking down at the community they helped reshape. They didn't need to say anything. The silence between them was comfortable and deep, a testament to a friendship that had survived the storm of change. They knew that there would still be days of doubt and moments where the old habit of sorry would try to creep back into their vocabulary. But they also knew that once you have tasted the freedom of living your truth, the old cages no longer have the power to hold you. They turned toward the lights of the town, ready to walk back into a life that was finally, beautifully their own. The stars emerged one by one, steady anchors in the vast, dark sky that seemed to reflect the newfound stability in their own hearts. The town below hummed with the sound of music and conversation, a melody of 100 different voices finally singing in their own unique keys. They walked down the hill together, their footsteps synchronized and their heads held high against the cool evening breeze. Life was still complicated, and the future was still unwritten, but they were no longer afraid to take up the space they were given. They reached the edge of the park and paused, sharing a final look of shared understanding before heading toward the warmth of the village. As the night settles low and heavy, a truth drifts through the dark like a quiet ember. The bravest thing you can do is stop shrinking to fit places you've outgrown. And when the weight of silence finally lifts, when you stop apologizing for your light, you'll find the world was simply waiting for you to turn it on.